This is Newsroom. Hello and welcome from a rather cold Johannesburg here in South Africa. My name, of course, is Evan Jensen. This show is very much live and broadcast from our studios here in Auckland Park. Don't forget, we also stream live on YouTube, so you can watch us live there with the whole show available all the time on demand on our YouTube channel. Now, today we look at the row that has erupted around Sudanese President Omar al-Bashir and his recent visit to the AU summit that was held here in Johannesburg. We look back at Youth Day, that was yesterday, and talk about the crisis of masculinity that young men are facing here in South Africa. And we close with a chat to local author Nonhlanhla Mnisi in our book slot a little bit later. But first, let's get today's news from Newsroom.
Good morning, I'm Anine Dormal. Let's take a look at the stories making headlines today. The South African National Defence Force says it's been shocked by reports saying its troops in Sudan were held hostage. Meanwhile, the United Nations has backed up claims by the SANDF that its troops serving as peacekeepers in Darfur were not endangered. Reports claim the troops were surrounded by Sudan's army, pending the safe return of President Omar al-Bashir from the AU summit in Johannesburg. Al-Bashir defied a High Court order not to leave the country.
We can confirm that the mission's South African troops were not held hostage or under any threat, as was reported in the media. The information we have from UNAMID is that they were not under any threat, and so that is where we stand. In terms of operational details, obviously the troops on the ground may have to go through maneuvers at any point in time, but in terms of whether they faced a threat or were surrounded or held hostage, no, they were not.
Eskom will brief the media on its plan for winter this morning. This when the Power Utilities Acting CEO, Brian Molefe, hosts his first briefing at Eskom's headquarters in Johannesburg. The progress of the utilities' maintenance work is also expected to be discussed. President Jacob Zuma has announced that an alliance summit will be convened to tackle youth unemployment. This as the unemployment rate among youth between the ages of 15 to 34 increased to 36.1% from 2008 to 2014. The president was speaking at the National Youth Day celebration in Pretoria.
We reiterate our call to the private sector to open their businesses to the youth for internships and apprentices in line with the Youth Employment Accord signed a few years ago. We have to work together to provide opportunities for the youth who are the future of our country.
South Korea's health ministry has recorded 8 new cases of Middle East respiratory syndrome, bringing the total to 162 cases. The number of the fatalities in the outbreak that began in May has now risen to 20. In the United States, U.S. billionaire Donald Trump has announced he will be running for president. Trump will run as a Republican for the White House in next year's presidential election. Speaking in New York, he promised to make America great again and said he'll be the greatest jobs president that God ever created. And in sport, Bafana managed to win a game after months of struggling. Yesterday, South Africa beat Angola 2-1 in an international friendly in Cape Town. Before the encounter, Bafana played 270 minutes of football without finding the back of the net. Coach Shakes Mashaba made 4 changes to the team that fired blanks against Gambia in the Africa Cup of Nations qualifier in Durban on Saturday. Well, remember, you can find all of those stories on our Newsroom Facebook page. Just search for Newsroom. You can also follow us on Twitter at SABC Newsroom. Evan, over to you.
Good morning once again. Thank you very much, Anine. Now, the row around Sudanese President Omar al-Bashir's visit to the AU summit still rages on, especially on social media. The South African Litigation Centre is now contemplating bringing contempt of court proceedings. This after the Sudanese president was allowed to leave South Africa earlier this week despite a High Court order ordering the state not to allow him to depart. Al-Bashir was in Sandton, near Johannesburg, to attend the African Union Summit. Meanwhile, the African Union Commission chairperson, Dr. Nkosazana Dlamini-Zuma, says there was nothing untoward about Omar al-Bashir attending the AU summit. She says the summit was governed by AU rules and South Africa had nothing to do with it. Bashir's attendance caused outrage, with the ICC demanding that South Africa arrest him for war crimes he committed in Darfur. Now, South Africa's litigation centre started all the row around the presence of al-Bashir in South Africa. International criminal justice lawyer at the SABC, Angela Mudukuti, joins us this morning to take this discussion a little bit forward. Very good morning to you, Angela. Thank you for joining us.
Good morning. Thank you for having me.
Contentious issue. Let's start at the beginning because there's so much to get through. But I want to start at the beginning with the contempt of court proceedings. How do you want to proceed with this and to what end?
Okay. First of all, we are waiting for the reasoning from the court. The court issued an order but said it would issue its actual reasoning and judgment later on. And we're also waiting for an affidavit from the state explaining how it was that Bashir escaped and which port of entry he went through and who was responsible for that. So when we've received all that information, we'll then decide how to proceed. So at this point, we're not speculating about what we're going to do. We need the right information first.
You are of the view that he escaped?
Absolutely. I mean, he's a fugitive of justice. He's wanted by the ICC. He's been indicted for 10 counts of crimes against humanity, genocide, and war crimes.
Okay, let's go back then. Why in the first place did you take this view and the matter to the High Court? Please just explain it to us, the sort of backstory for yourself.
Absolutely. So Bashir was indicted by the ICC in 2009 and again in 2010 for genocide, war crimes and crimes against humanity committed in the Darfur region after an insurgency that started in 2003. So from that point on, he's been wanted by the ICC. South Africa is a signatory to the Rome Statute of the ICC and has domesticated the Rome Statute into domestic legislation by way of the ICC Act. And by virtue of those commitments made at the international level and at domestic law level, South Africa has obligations to arrest Bashir.
What about the African Union and the kinds of immunity that goes with what happens at an event such as this? It only happens to be in South Africa, to have been held in South Africa. How do you view, let's call it the point of view of Dr. Nkosazana Dlamini-Zuma?
I would have to respectfully say that that is inaccurate. The AU summit was held on South African territory, hence South Africa has jurisdiction. And I'd like to use the example of Malawi in 2012. They were scheduled to host the AU summit, and they bluntly said they would not host al-Bashir, and the summit was moved to Ethiopia. So this question of, because the AU summit is in South Africa, it's AU rules, incorrect. South African land, South African jurisdiction.
What about the greater good, the principle of the greater good, that we here in Africa, we are trying to create a prosperous Africa at peace with itself? The gentleman in question is involved in skirmishes that is destabilizing not just a country but an entire region. South Africa finds itself in the middle of a process to try and broker some sort of deal. Your response?
I think we need to remember that there are victims here and that justice and accountability is very important for any sort of peace building in the future. And for as long as fugitives of justice are allowed to prevail and to travel freely and not answer to charges before international courts, we're not building a prosperous and successful and peaceful Africa.
What about the legitimacy of the ICC? The AU questions it, South Africa questions it, I question it. How do you view it?
I think the ICC has come under attack, but I also think we need to remember that it has a massive global mandate. Accountability for genocide, war crimes, and crimes against humanity is not an easy task. I still think the institution has great legitimacy, and I think it needs support and critical engagement. We can criticize the ICC. We can talk about how UN Security Council referrals get to the court. I mean, there are many, many aspects we could discuss, but that doesn't mean we don't need to support it.
I hear exactly what you are saying, but here in Africa we feel we've been at the effect of these kinds of, let's call it easy targets. Easy to target African leaders, isn't it? It's easy to make African leaders the scapegoat for all the ills and all the human rights abuses in the world, when the great human rights abuses around the world go unpunished and, I believe, unseen by the ICC. Even in this instance, the ICC parked the matter of al-Bashir and said, oh, we're not going to investigate it. We will rest our case on this matter so far. Only when he came to South Africa this weekend suddenly became an issue. It feels as if there is a scapegoat mentality within the ICC.
First of all, let me correct something. So the Bashir case came to the ICC because it was a referral from the United Nations Security Council, referral 1593. And since then, the ICC has been investigating this process and has indicted both sides of the conflict, so the rebel movement as well as the Darfur government. But they've received very little support from the Security Council and obviously from Darfur and Sudan itself. So they've been forced to put the matter on ice because they're not being given access to victims, to witnesses, and to evidence. So I wouldn't say that they've parked the matter. I would say that the situation and circumstances have made it difficult for them to proceed.
They didn't investigate further. They didn't see fit to spend more money on this case because obviously their advice pointed to the fact that there could really be no result to it. That's why they parked it. And it speaks a lot about the kind of vigilance and the kind of way that there's this follow-through. I want to take the discussion a little bit further.
Right.
When we talk about war criminals and crimes against humanity, where do crimes against humanity in places like Palestine, in places like Iraq, and the wider Middle East, Syria and so forth, where does this sit within the ICC, and where does it sit with someone like yourself?
I'm glad you brought that up because this brings to light the jurisdictional limits of the ICC. There are three ways in which something comes before the ICC. If you're a signatory to the Rome Statute, you can do what is known as a self-referral. The prosecutor can exercise a jurisdiction, or the United Nations Security Council can bring a referral. And these are the only three ways in which a case comes before the ICC. And you're right, the ICC does have jurisdictional limits, because now we only see Palestine has come before the court because Palestine has signed and ratified the Rome Statute, which is the only way justice can be done in that context. And yes, the United States hasn't signed. Yes, we have questions in Iraq and Afghanistan, but those are geopolitical constrictions. And we need to challenge the ICC on its jurisdiction, but not criticize it for not having jurisdiction. So we should talk about why hasn't China and Russia referred Syria, for example, to the ICC? Politics. It's not in their interest to refer Syria or Zimbabwe or any other country, or Iraq or Afghanistan. So the ICC has limits, is my point.
So that says everything about the work that the ICC can really do and the legitimacy of the organization. And one can then see why it becomes easy to target African leaders.
Well, I don't think African leaders are being targeted. We have legitimate crimes that have been committed and legitimate victims. Who's going to speak for the African victims? I mean, let's look at our own continent at the moment. The SADC tribunal, currently disbanded, and in future may not have access for individuals. Who's going to hear the grievances of Southern African victims? The African court, no criminal jurisdiction. Who's dealing with their issues? So the ICC is not targeting Africa, but is instead addressing the fact that there are crimes that are being committed and using the fact that they can exercise jurisdiction. So should we forget about Africa because we can't go after George Bush?
What about
I'm not sure that makes sense.
What about, you talk about George Bush. Why is it then that we have an international body that is set to police crimes against humanity and the like, but the biggest country in the world, the United States, is not a member, is not a signatory of the ICC. Without the US being part of this process, it certainly lacks legitimacy there as well. Or is it a law for certain countries and a different set of laws for another?
I am 100% with you that it is problematic that the US is not a member of the ICC. But the fact that the ICC functions regardless of that is also something we should notice. Because we have other powerful countries that are signatories to the Rome Statute, the UK, France. So I don't think just because the US is not doing something that we should all abandon the court. I think instead we should challenge the US and its various, its dodgy criminal human rights record and see what we can do there.
Do you think it would send the right message to African leaders if somebody like Tony Blair and the weapons of mass destruction scenario that played out less than about a decade ago, if someone like that appears before the ICC, surely it would pave the way for others to step forward and say, well, if Tony Blair is prepared to stand for the creation that was the, let's call it the war in the middle or the war in Iraq, then we should do the same.
I think it would definitely help the ICC to expand the geography of its docket. Absolutely, I agree with you. How that has to happen, though, we have to follow the law and follow jurisdiction.
And just clear up, before I let you go, the law now that you would like to see take its course, the man is back in Khartoum.
Yes.
What's the point then now of us continuing with this discussion before the courts?
I think what we have to look at here is that the South African government has defied a court order. That is what we need to look at now. And that doesn't bode well for rule of law in South Africa and for the understanding that South Africa is a constitutional democracy built on human rights and justice. I think that's the issue we have to address now.
When we deal with law, we don't look at the principle of the greater good.
Well, law is about the greater good. Justice is about the greater good. Accountability is about the greater good.
Thank you for joining us today. Wonderful, wonderful views. That is Angela Mudakuti, who is a criminal justice lawyer at the Southern African Litigation Centre. Of course, we spoke about well, the recent going-ons around a visit, Omar al-Bashir. And of course, I can tell you that President al-Bashir arrived in Khartoum to a hero's welcome. But the diplomatic, political and legal ramifications here in South Africa is far from over.
There's the policy that is...
We have Home Affairs, we have SARS, we have the police, we do have Intelligence Department. All of these officials within their departments should have been locked up.
Dusdanige departementen moet opgesluit worden.
So that we don't have a situation where you have NGOs that are sponsored and then they use or they attract funding for themselves by embarrassing the state or South Africa as a government through these frivolous calls. I know those who are lawyers say, no, this is law. Yeah, fine, it is law, but it can't be that South Africa cannot decide who comes here and who does not come in this country. It's wrong.
We are a sovereign country. When the AU convenes a meeting here, all the heads of state are subject to diplomatic immunity. And the people who are telling us that why don't we arrest al-Bashir, why are they not calling for the arrest of Benjamin Netanyahu, who has bombed Gaza to smithereens and actually killed innocent people?
We say al-Bashir must rot in jail. He must be prosecuted for his sins, but he must be subjected to a proper justice system. Therefore, the ICC is not such a justice system which can give a fair hearing to an African leader.
Now, the United Nations Secretary General believes that with more countries signing up to the Rome Statute, the stronger the treaty governing the International Criminal Court and its jurisdiction would become. Now, human rights groups have expressed their disappointment with the government of South Africa over Bashir's departure, while the UN chief has insisted that the authority of the ICC must be respected and its decisions implemented.
There are 123 countries that are states parties to the Rome Statute, with Africa making up the largest regional bloc at 34. But many countries remain outside the court's jurisdiction, including the United States, Russia, China, and others.
That's something that the coalition takes very seriously. And one of our core missions is to ensure that the ICC is a universal court. And so we absolutely call on all states to join the ICC. And at the same time, we want states, even when they're not members of the court, to actively participate as far as they can.
And while the UN has called for parties to implement their obligations, they accept that the Rome Statute needs to be strengthened.
Like any treaty, the more countries sign on to them, the stronger they become. And the ICC is no exception in that sense. The actions of the ICC, the actions of the prosecutor of the ICC are independent of the Secretary General. And again, I think the Secretary General is very clear in that the ICC needs to be supported by as many countries as possible.
United to End Genocide has called on the Security Council to hold South Africa accountable for failing to arrest President Bashir, referring to a travesty of justice. Shervin Brycepease, SABC News, New York.
Now, al-Bashir, who is wanted by the ICC for what they say call genocide and crimes against humanity in Darfur, arrived in South Africa on Saturday to attend the African Union summit, prompting a court bid by a rights group here in South Africa to have him arrested. Despite the order, al-Bashir left the country. Here are some of your views, and there have been plenty of views on social media around what has become a very topical subject here on platforms in South Africa. At SABC Newsroom, of course, is where we welcome your tweets. Let's have a look at some of our viewers and others. Piliki Sebola says, contempt charges for government officials on al-Bashir saga is just a formality. Damage has been done already, says Piliki. Vusi Demakwayo says, before we arrest Omar al-Bashir, let's ask a sobering question. Who supplied him and dictators with weapons? Africans don't make guns, says Vusi. Kolani says, it is outrageous for another country to hold SA soldiers or any citizen for that matter as a hostage. Now, Kolani, if you saw our news report a little bit earlier, the UN has come out and said no South Africans were held hostage. That was a fabrication. And look at the source, where it comes from. Castro Ngobese says, where was this SA litigation center during the struggle against the apartheid system, a system that was declared a crime against humanity? Castro Ngobese says that. Stephanie Johansson says, Sudanese president's escape highlights the determination of African lawyers. Follow South African legislation. Yes, they are of the view that President al-Bashir escaped from South Africa. Now let's have a look at our tweet pick of the day. Something a little bit different, but very much in tune with where we are. Of course, Youth Day was celebrated here in South Africa. This one comes from Lazonia Primary Caption in Pretoria as they celebrated Youth Day. What a wonderful picture. Young people, that's the future of South Africa. Within 35 years, more than 1 billion young people under 18 will be living on the continent that you see drawn in that picture. Beautiful Africa, Mama Africa. Take a look at front pages from around the globe now. Elsewhere in the world, of course, it's also going on in the United Kingdom. The Independent reports that fathers of children feared to have been taken to join ISIS by their mothers have made a desperate plea for them to come home. Yes, it is a constant theme in the United Kingdom. Moving to Israel, the Jerusalem Post reports that the Israel Defense Forces and the Israeli police declared a section of the northeast Golan Heights a closed military zone after Al-Qaeda's Nusra Front killed one Syrian Druze officer and wounded 10 others in the border town of Hadar. Then, finally in China, the South China Morning Post reports 6 out of 10 suspects arrested over an alleged bomb plot in Hong Kong could face up to 20 years in jail after they were charged jointly yesterday with conspiracy to cause an explosion. That's elsewhere in the news. Let's come back to South Africa a little bit. This is what's happening around the country. Here in Johannesburg, where judgment in the murder and rape trial of Bongani Dadla continues in the Palm Ridge Magistrates Court. Dadla is accused of raping his niece twice, impregnating her and then killing their child when he was 3 years old after continued abuse. Down south in Cape Town, the 2 men jailed for killing 6-month-old baby Jordan Lee Norton are expected to apply for parole in the Paarl Magistrates Court. These 2 men, along with 3 others, were found guilty of the baby's murder in 2005. Still in Cape Town, acclaimed artist Zwelethu Mthethwa is expected to return to court when his lawyer will continue to argue the CCTV system that captured his alleged victim's murder is unreliable. Mthethwa is accused of kicking a 23-year-old sex worker to death. Also in Cape Town, 6 men are expected to appear in the White River Magistrates Court next Wednesday to apply for bail conditions after they were caught by rangers in the Satara area of the Kruger National Park with suspected poaching tools last week. Now that cannot be in the Cape Town Magistrates Court. I'll talk to our producer, probably a little finger fault. That's probably a little bit further north. But as Youth Day celebrations continue throughout this month, let's take another look at what young people have to say about what it means to be young in South Africa today.
And the significance of youth in our country, I think the energy for transformation is going to come from the young people, but I think The sadness is that we lack leadership in order to harness that energy. In the same way that we look at the uprising that happened in Soweto, there was a lot of momentum, a lot of passion, but ultimately a lack of foresight and wisdom in order to guide that into a constructive place. I think at the moment we're sitting in a similar position where there's a lot of young people with a lot of potential, but what we really need as a nation is leadership. And so ultimately, while young people can bring change, we need an older generation to invest in us in order to make it sustainable.
We all have all the answers when we're 22 years old, I tell you. Anyhow, these are some of the views of young people here in South Africa, what they want South Africa to be when they are old and grey like some of us. Anyhow, you're watching Newsroom. We'll be back with you after a short little break.
I know a better route. Incoming. Watch out. Let's brighten it up a little. I can handle this. Engineered intuition. The new Audi A6.
Welcome to Network, a technology news program that also discusses what's trending in social media in and around Africa. MTN has launched its new movie and television streaming service, Front Row. If it's trending, we will find it. That's Network with me, Spumelele Zondi, every Sunday at 7:30 p.m. only on the SABC News Channel.
Welcome back. This is Newsroom. Yesterday, South Africa celebrated Youth Day, and that day has become synonymous with the iconic image of the dying Hector Peterson being carried by another student while his sister ran in the road next to them. Hector was only 13 years old at that time. Now today, violence continues to play out in our streets with young men most at risk. Today on Newsroom, we look at the legacy of June 16 and the spillover effect it has on young men. Now, from our studios in Cape Town, we are joined by Professor Kopano Ratele, an expert on men and masculinity. A very good morning to you, Professor. Thank you for joining us.
Good morning, Eben.
What is the culture and legacy, call it culture and legacy of apartheid that we are battling with today? Is that a direct association with the violence that we see?
No doubt. I mean, it's a deep-running culture, if you will, but this is a thick culture, a culture in a thick sense. It's a culture of violence, as some researchers long time ago used to say, but also it's a culture of gender, of a particular way of how men are constructed, how we construct our masculinities as men, but also how our mothers, our fathers, our grandparents contribute to the kinds of men we become.
You mentioned the mothers and fathers. I want to take one straight out of there, and I want to talk about the fathers, because the statistics in South Africa paint a rather bleak picture of especially fatherhood and how that plays out within the various, call it race groups in South Africa. In Indian households and white households, the father is present 85% and above. And we see the kind of, let's call it success they have within education and other spheres. Where in coloured and African households, the father is present less than 40% of the time. And can we make the connection then with the levels of delinquency and so forth that we see within those two specific communities?
Certainly. I mean, you know, we touched on this the last time. If you grow up in a fractured family, if you will, a family where the father is not present, but also more widely adult men are not present, the chances of developing a healthy and positive masculinity are decreased. Are decreased in the sense that you don't have a model to play off from. You don't have somebody who you can, this is what my father did, this is what the old man did in my family, and take it from there. So you're beginning basically with a background, an empty history, where you have to create yourself. You have to become, the phrase a self-made man comes into mind here, but really there are very few self-made men. You have to have some people who went before you. You have to stand on the shoulders of people who went before you. And in this particular case, you have to have a model of a grandfather, of a father, of adult men more generally in your community and specifically in your family. But of course, one has to bring in social fathers here. Now, this fracturing we're talking about doesn't only happen in families. It happens in a wider community where men, mostly in these fractured communities, such as, that you have in South Africa, where men have checked out, basically, have checked out for all sorts of reasons, including that they themselves cannot fulfill the demands of a socially acceptable, socially accepted and valued masculinity.
With our history and where we've been on this journey for the last 20 years, not just in South Africa, but Africa in general, how do we understand masculinity and the role of a man? Has it changed? Does it need to change?
Well, it has. It has. The moment we're talking about is 76, but of course you can take it to an earlier generation, sometime even before that. So you had at that moment young people stepping forward and saying, well, our fathers, our mothers have not taken up the cudgels, have not fought this struggle that affects us. And the struggle at that particular moment, of course, was around language, but it was also a general struggle around education. And so when young men took up the stage as leaders of the struggle at that moment in Soweto, in Langa, in other parts of the country, something happened right there. I mean, if you have young people, specifically young men, I mean, we have to bring men into the picture here. The news this news you just ran through about men in courts, men raping, 6 men here, an artist there. What you're talking about is precisely this moment. So at that moment, but early, of course, you cannot let apartheid off the hook. What you have right here is a system that inculcated a certain way of being a man. And this way of being a man, of course, on both sides, white, black, Indian, colored, this system said to be a man is to fight. To be a man is to lead in particular kinds of ways. So then fast forward into history. Right now you haven't interrupted that legacy of young men having been taught, and men generally being taught, that the particular kinds of masculinities that are quote-unquote viable in these societies are aggressive, are tough, are risk-taking. And clearly you need to interrupt that. You need to interrupt that. So yesterday, this whole week when we're talking about youth, you did not differentiate, but young people have done that. You did not differentiate between youth as gendered. That you have young men, you have young women, you have transgender, you have queer. You need to do that. And when you do that, you start to realize that there are specific needs of young men that are different from specific needs of young women, of transgender youth, of queer men. And because young men are at the forefront of violence, so you need specific kinds of programs to interrupt that violence.
What is the way forward with regards to those programs and then the wider message that we have to spread in our schools and in our homes?
I was reading the new NYC National Youth Policy 2020, and I was looking for what does it say about men, young men, as both young and gendered. I didn't find any. So what you need to offer from where I'm sitting is a vision. Is a vision of young men who aspire, young men who are educated, young men who are non-violent. You absolutely need to do that in this country. But this vision, by the way, does not only apply to young men in poor neighborhoods. You need this vision also to the police. If you have young policemen who go into the force. They come from these neighborhoods, they come from the same families. These young men have also not been taught different kinds of masculinities. I mean, the army and the police are as militarized as anything. They tend to use guns, and you know cases where a policeman goes into the police station and starts shooting the girlfriend or the wife and his colleagues. Clearly the kinds of masculinities that are predominant in this country affect both the people who are supposed to protect us, but also those young men in those neighborhoods that need other men who are peaceful, who are non-violent. So you need this vision. This vision should be in that national youth policy, where it says what kinds of vision, what kinds of masculinities that are, if you will, that are soft, because people call them so. They are not soft. In fact, peace and nonviolence are the most courageous thing you can. If you can walk away from a fight when somebody's provoking you, when somebody's saying you are, they could use all kinds of words when you are basically that you are weak. So you can walk away from that. Of course, you get to live another day, but you also start to learn how to deal with your own emotions when somebody is trying to aggress against you, to provoke you to be aggressive.
Professor, it's a discussion that we will continue to have, hopefully you'll join us in the future to further this. That's Professor Kopano Ratele, who's with the Institute for Social and Health Sciences at the University of Pretoria. Now, time for us to take a quick look at some of your views, some of your comments. Of course, news lives now. Everyone has an opinion. Joseline says, every day after work I realize how the youth is becoming less and less aware of their potential as the future or present leaders. Waking up was a mission this morning. Couldn't the youth of 76 protest for one more day? Asked Lebekere. You need to wake up and get up and do your bit. Evan says, time to begin my last day as a 21-year-old. Basically feels like that age where real-world problems emerge and my youth falls by the wayside. Don't worry, Evan, you'll still be a young man for at least another 10 years before responsibility takes over. Tulani Zondi says, funny how most provinces had something educational about Youth Day yesterday. In Durbs, we had chill spots, says Tulani, like a boss, he says there on his picture. Quick look at our tweet of the day. This one comes from Imbarak Chirgia saying, Ramadan is a noble guest that has come for a few days. Treat him honorably and the most generous with your time and efforts. Of course, tonight is the night. Tomorrow will be the first day of this year's fasting period for Muslims all around the world. And hopefully we will have some expertise to tell us about the month of Ramadan, and also there are some discussion points around it. But let's take a quick look at what's on our Facebook page. The Steel and Engineering Industries Federation of South Africa yesterday said that Eskom's proposed 25% electricity price hike, if approved, will further cripple the already bleeding South African economy. Then the United Nations has halted South African media reports that South African National Defence Force troops were held hostage by Sudan's army pending the safe return of President Omar al-Bashir to Khartoum. And real estate mogul and TV personality Donald "The Fringe" Trump announced his candidacy for the Republican nomination in the 2016 U.S. presidential election. Trump was quoted saying that he will be the greatest jobs president that God ever created. Really? This is the man who said South Africa is a mess and he would never travel to South Africa. Donald Trump. If Donald Trump becomes the president of the free world, we will no longer be free. Anyhow, June is Blood Donor Month. Don't forget that. The South African National Blood Service urges people to come out and donate blood. The theme, thank you for saving my life. A message of appreciation from blood recipients. Let's take a look at one such message from one recipient as we go to a break.
is way more likely to be killed by a lover, her husband, than she is by anyone else.
Christopher Panayuto, accused of orchestrating the murder of his wife, Jade, is to apply for bail in a bid to get out of the overcrowded cells and escape the samp and beans diet.
Here is a man that's accused of killing his wife. He's worried about the special diet. He's worried that he's eating beans and samp there.
Sadly, a fan was also reportedly killed in a scuffle with police during the pitch invasion.
I'm surprised that the city press is going with the picture of the celebration instead of showing us the picture of the person that has been killed.
Watch Media Monitor with me, Alicia Jali, Sundays at 9 a.m. only on the SABC News channel.
Welcome back. You're watching Newsroom on SABC News. Let's take a look at the stories making headlines today. The South African National Defence Force says it has been shocked by reports saying its troops in Sudan were held hostage. Meanwhile, the United Nations has backed up claims by the SANDF that its troops serving as peacekeepers in Darfur were not in danger. Reports claim the troops were surrounded by Sudan's army pending the safe return of President Omar al-Bashir from the AU summit in Johannesburg. Al-Bashir defied a High Court order not to leave the country. Eskom will brief the media on its plan for winter this morning. This when the Power Utilities Acting CEO Brian Molefe hosts his first briefing at Eskom's headquarters in Johannesburg. And South Korea's health ministry has recorded 8 new cases of Middle East respiratory syndrome, bringing the total to 162 cases. The number of fatalities in the outbreak that began last month has now risen to 20. Well, remember, you can find all of those stories on our Newsroom Facebook page. Just search for Newsroom. You can also follow us on Twitter at SABC Newsroom. Given, back to you.
Thanks very much, Janine. At 25, Sowetan-born Nonhlanhla Mnisi has written 5 books. Motivational speaker, author, radio personality, and also a personal assistant to Yvonne Chaka Chaka, says that her motivation comes from her own personal journey, Shades of My Brutality, which is one of the books we look at. Today looks into Nonhlanhla's sad story of rejection, loss, poverty, and misunderstanding, something most people have been exposed to or experienced in our lives. What makes Nonhlanhla's story different is the kindness offered by those who were in her life at every juncture. The book will make you believe in human kindness, what we in Africa know as Ubuntu. Today, she's with us in studio to tell us her story. Good morning.
Morning, how are you, Ben?
I'm very good, thank you. 5 books at the age of 25. I thought we don't read here in South Africa.
Firstly, before I jump into the book, I just want to make a correction that I'm not Yvonne's PA, but
don't worry, my producers.
The public relations.
Don't worry, my producers get it wrong all the time.
Okay.
So, you are friends. You are not a personal assistant.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for clearing that up. Sometimes, overzealousness gets over. But tell us about Shades of Brutality, this journey in particular. Is it a story of a young person finding herself? Is it a South African story?
It is a South African story, and firstly, I'd like to open actually with one of the reviews on this book by Wendy Luhabe, where she said that it is a testament of what is possible when we become prisoners of hope and allow moments of grace to embrace us with courage for the future. So you look at it from a point of saying that I remember during my varsity days in marketing, we were taught about the input, the process, as well as the output. Now, in my mind, when I captured this story, I was saying, here was my input, and this is the process, or this is the these are the things that I had to do to survive, and this was then the output, in a way. I mean, I believe that most people die in the process before they reach the output level, in a way. So Really, that's what was going through my
Output
mind.
being the contribution that we make
Most definitely.
to society, how we create a legacy, how we make it better for those coming behind us.
Most definitely, to live to tell a story. And I do believe that, or rather I've met people out there who have actually gone through way worse things than what I've gone through. So I've gotten to a point where I said, okay, not that my story is special as such, but I was just given courage by God, you know, to be able to ink it down for the next person to actually find themselves. Because I do believe that in as much as our journeys are unique, but our experiences are common. And it is when you pick up the book and you see where you can find yourself in.
No, it's Youth Month. Yesterday was Youth Day. You're a young person. You've done a lot at...
I hope I could say I feel young.
After writing 5 books, I'm sure you feel quite old.
Yeah.
But tell me, what does it mean to be young in South Africa today?
I think, firstly, we live in a world of possibilities. I mean, I believe South Africa is one of the developing countries economically, and I think things are different now. I mean, if we look at the people that we look up to when they tell stories of what life was for them back then, and we trace where we are now. I mean, I was lucky to meet, speaking of the writing journey, I met up with a lady, Miriam Tlali, who runs a bookshop. You know, she's like 80 plus, you know, and when she tells me about the fact that they were not even allowed to publish books during their time, and I look at how I've managed to publish 5 books within 2 years, and I say, wow, you know, we live in a different world altogether.
It's a different world. That brings me to the next kind of question I want to ask you. When I was a young man, when I was your age, we were activists. It was a natural thing. It was automatic. You go to school, your group, you're all activists. You all fight the system. It was a very simple clarity that we had. Do you think there's enough activism around amongst young people in South Africa? Do you think young people are still passionate about, call it the greater good, and about making a contribution?
I'd say we've come a long way, much as I do believe we have a long way to go. Because it's a certain percentage of people that you'd see that are active, you know, in saying we understand where we come from as a nation. We've taken time to learn to know the history of our world, and this is where we are now. So it's rare that, you know, it's a rare case scenario for me to actually say that they are ignorant as such, but you know, I believe that, I mean, nowadays we even have social media. So it's easier to even connect to some of these things because they'll easily say, hashtag this, hashtag that.
Yeah,
Much as I do believe that hashtag doesn't bring results.
I've got a problem with hashtag.
Because they sit at home and say, I say no to xenophobia and hashtag. It doesn't bring results. So it's...
You know, it's my pet hate in the modern world. You know, I come from an activism background, and I look at this kind of, I call it slacktivism, because, you know, you're really slacking in your activism when you say, oh, let's start a hashtag. It doesn't make the world any better. Doesn't make a contribution.
I mean, I do believe that, though, it is one powerful tool that people could use to come together. I think we're not maximizing its power to the fullest.
Quickly, in conclusion, shades of brutality. Tell me about the deep-seated emotion in that book title. It's a book that it captures mostly my journey at university, which is why when I look at the distribution models, I look into the schools and all that, because I do believe it's a journey that speaks to someone who is finding themselves in that particular time and point, in a way. It speaks about things, or rather, that I've gone through that were brutal to me, in a way. I talk about my experiences wherein I had to go, you know, with where I had to shoot. It's too explicit. It's too explicit,
and
too varied.
You know, but
well, it's a good point. It's a good place then for us to end it. People should go out and buy the book because there's some real explicit moments. Says Shades of My Brutality. A young woman who's written her 5th book at the age of 25. I'm very keen and interested in reading it. Thank you for joining us this morning and sharing a very personal story with us.
Thank you.
Now, we have to move on, as we always do, almost at the end of the show today. We not only remember the 1976 youth uprising, but we also celebrate and remember the life of our ballad icon. That was Eddie Zondi, was it? That passed away day before yesterday. We remember Eddie once again. Don't forget, at SABC Newsroom is where you can send us your tweets. fasting isn't about burning tires, burning calories, burning your ego, pride and sins, and see how this blessed month ahead benefits your soul. Yes, a billion Muslims around the world will be fasting from tomorrow. Dear everyone, let me preempt your Ramadan question. No, not even water, says Susan. Zeus says, don't change yourself only for Ramadan, but change yourself for your entire life. Yes, it's easy to say that, isn't it? Samira says, I love how always ends in Snapchat stories with Allah knows best. The reminder is always so comforting. Raz says, let's do this. Hashtag Ramadan. I think that's kind of where most or large sections of the Muslim community is. It is a deeply spiritual month ahead for those who will be fasting. It's a time of personal growth, and let's have some understanding if we are not fasting about what our Muslim brothers and sisters will be going through. That's where we leave it today. This show is broadcast live from our studios in Auckland Park, Johannesburg, every weekday morning between 9 and 10 a.m. Don't forget, we stream live on YouTube at that time, with the whole show available on demand on our YouTube channel. This is SABC News. You've been watching Newsroom. We love it in the morning.